If you guys don't know Latasha, she's done some pretty hardcore, amazing work to highlight what the coal mining companies have been attempting to do to the water systems in what's colonially known as Southern Alberta. So, Latasha, I will let you take over and do your thing. So, hi for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse. Um, I guess I'll start introducing myself while I bring up my slides here. So, Okinasokwa, Nisko Anista Matoomiikamootsakii, Nin Anista Gitogyapi, Nixist Anista Saksi Sanaki, Nox Anista Agapi Ginapiaki, and my Muslim and Kokom are Willie and Shirley Oje. Note Dut Gana. So my name is First Steelswoman. My English name is Latasha Calf Robe. I am the founder of Niitsitapi Water Protectors. We're a grassroots collective of land and water protectors that reside within the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And like Jesse mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work in the last little bit to protect the eastern slopes and the Oldman Watershed from further molestation at the hands of open pit mining. And so I'll talk a little bit about that today and about some of like the observations that I've seen over the last little bit. I am quite new to this space. It's actually only been about a year since I learned about all of this mining stuff. And NWP really did form quite organically and in such a really cool way that I can also talk about a little bit later. I am here. We have a bunch of co-leads. They put me in front. They put me in charge of talking and going in front of the camera most of the time. But yeah, so I'll start out. Yeah, so to just kind of start, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm from the Blood Tribe, or the Kainaiwa First Nation, which is currently located in what's now known as Southern Alberta. We're just north of the border, and we're part of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Where I grew up is really, the Blood Reserve is bordered by the Belly River, the Oldman River, and St. Mary's River. And it's a pretty cool place. I mean, I'm not gonna lie. It was pretty cool growing up on the Blood Reserve, where my family stays. We stay right where the foothills meet the plains there, and we're really just not too far away from what's now known as Waterton National Park. What's really cool is that's actually where my ancestor's name, Unistanam, which translates to calf robe, that's where his name comes from. It's from the Waterton Lakes area. Those waters hold a lot of power and sacredness for not just the Blood Tribe, but for all of the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. These areas, such as Waterton Lakes, continue to be used by the Blackfoot and by other First Nations in the area. And, lots of the work that NWP has been doing has been in response to coal mining, which is proposed in the eastern slopes or in the Crow's Nest Pass area. So if you ever travel through Southern Alberta, there's only, a few different ways that you can get get from Alberta into BC, and you have to go through these mountain pathways. The one in Southern Alberta is known as the Crow's Nest Pass, and there's all those highways that go in through, and you can get through there. This photo here is actually one that I took up in Anitopisi's playground. This is a really important and sacred area for not just the Blood Tribe, but for all of the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Oh, you can only see my speaker's notes. Hold on. Haha, I got this wrong. I shared it wrong. Give me 1 second. I guess I should have checked that earlier. Oh, Zoom. There, how's that?
It's good.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, sorry about that. I'll keep going. So this is Anitopisi's playground. Now that you can see the bigger picture of it, it looks a lot nicer than the little screen in the corner. Yeah, this is Anitopisi's playground, and like I was mentioning, it's a really important area for the Blackfoot, and this is really in the headwaters of the Oldman River. There's lots of stories that are held in this place. And And this picture, this place really brings me a lot of peace and really reminds me of kind of why we do what we do as NWP. Um, these areas and these waters need to be protected for so many reasons. But even just looking at their beauty can also just bring a lot of peace and comfort when you need it. So I do always really like to talk about history. I think you can't leave it out anytime that you're talking about, water or our, Indigenous rights and everything like that. So the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy are quite large. They range from the North Saskatchewan River down along the Rocky Mountains, southward into the Montana area, right down to around Yellowstone National Park, and then into the greater parts of Saskatchewan. So the area that I'm talking about where mining is kind of right where this little lightning bolt that I put in is. And these lands have been traditionally stewarded by the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which consists of the Kainai, the Siksika, Piikani, and Anitopisi Piikani. The Blackfoot Confederacy, we have a pretty large population, which is approximately like 24,000 of us. Our traditional territories, as you can see, were cut by the Canada and US border. So our relatives on the south side of the border, they're chilling. They're doing pretty good. But these areas are really interesting. And I think when you think about the Blackfoot, people often refer to us as the children of the plains, and this is true. You see us on the big screen, you'll see us as buffalo hunters, you'll see us, by Western ways, you'll see us wandering the plains aimlessly. But while those things may be true, we're also people of the mountains. Lots of our creation stories, lots of our medicines, lots of our trade routes, lots of, where we shared things with other bordering nations, we're in these mountain areas, and they continue to be in these mountain areas. Lots of the spirits that we call on and lots of our ancestors and their stories are tied to the eastern slopes from the Rocky Mountains. It's due to the long legacy of colonialism that we were pushed out of these areas because of things like resource extraction, and because of the high probability of resource extraction. These pristine lands, settlers really wanted them. They're not just beautiful, but they house all different kinds of resources. And this area is really important as well because, things like the railway that went through connecting Canada to the BC side. So over the past couple hundred years, the Blackfoot have been really strategically pushed out of these areas, and they continue to be. And we see this through multiple things like farming and agriculture that continue to push the Blackfoot out of these areas and make it harder and harder for us to access the lands and walk on the lands that our ancestors have since time immemorial. Our Niitsitapi way of life, so just like many Indigenous people, is directly tied to the land. We are the land. We're an extension of all of our relatives, which include all of those in non-human form. These areas, we don't believe that there's just one sacred area or that there's sacred places, because all of this, all land and all water is sacred, and they're all interconnected. And we as mere human beings, we have no right to destroy the things we did not create. We aren't above the environment or below it. We're part of it. And as that comes our responsibility to ensure its survival and, to think beyond just survival, to think of how we can ensure thriving lands and thriving people. In this area as well, of course, is the Blackfoot Treaty, otherwise known as Treaty Number 7. An important note to make here is that this treaty isn't just signed with the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. Some of the nations included, the additional nations included with Treaty Number 7 are the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Stoney Nakoda nations, including the Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley. This is really important to highlight here because when we think about coal in Alberta and the way that government, both the federal government and provincial government, like to move when they think of consultation, um, they really like to try and separate our nations. They try to pin them against each other. They say one thing to somebody and then they say something to somebody else. And within Treaty 7, there's three different language groups. You know, the Blackfoot Confederacy, we speak Blackfoot. The Tsuut'ina, they speak Dene, and then the Stoney Nakoda, they speak Sioux. So we have three different language groups. We have three different, you know, identities, different creation stories, all these kinds of things. And this is really important. And, you know, if you've lived in this area or you've engaged in government relations, you can see how, especially the provincial government likes to take advantage of this, and they really do this to separate Treaty 7. I say this really, you know, I just wanted to point that out today because there's other treaty areas where they may have, you know, just one language group or there's slight variations in that language, but they have more similarities, whereas in Treaty Number 7, like you said, we're quite distinct from one another. And oftentimes these can lead to long-standing disagreements, which unfortunately lead to better outcomes for colonial governments. And yeah. And that's really important when we talk about mining, because there's been a huge mess when it comes to open pit coal mining in Alberta. Open pit mining isn't something that you would necessarily hear of every day in southern Alberta prior to this past year or so. Mines have been generally inactive in this part of Alberta, largely in response to this 1976 coal policy, which was an Alberta policy that categorized the eastern slopes into different categories. So some of them had different restrictions that, you know, allowed for no coal exploration or development, and then other categories there you could do exploration and potentially open mines, assuming that companies got their permits and all that kind of thing. I will also note that this policy, while it was seen as progressive for its time, it is totally flawed. It's flawed for many reasons. One is that it completely excludes and doesn't take into account Indigenous ways of knowing or being. There was no consultation with Indigenous peoples. And as you can see just from the year here, it predates a lot of really important legislation and, you know, Indigenous rights movements. And so it was really outdated, and it still is outdated. And unfortunately, this policy was rescinded really secretively by the UCP government last spring, not this past spring. And they rescinded this in the middle of the pandemic without anybody knowing and with no consultation with First Nations in Treaty 7 or within any of the treaty areas in Alberta. They did have a duty to consult, and because of this, the rescinding of this policy, it opened up the floodgates for coal exploration in these really vital areas of land. If you've ever been to southern Alberta, it's really dry. We don't have a lot of water. Our water is already overdrawn from. There's lots of agriculture in the area, which leads to further water and land degradation. So the water that we do have, we really do need to spend time protecting it, not just through Western policy frameworks, but also as Indigenous people revitalizing our practices. So when this coal exploration stuff happened after the rescinding of this coal policy, it wreaked quite major havoc in these areas. There was large trucks coming in, clear cutting different forest areas to make way for roads. They were doing lots of drill pits, all that kind of stuff. Because this policy was rescinded, there was a huge public outcry. And this is where NWP has come in a lot in raising awareness, because while there was a public outcry, Indigenous voices were missing from all of that. And everywhere, from tribal government levels to grassroots level, all that kind of thing. And so part of NWP's role was we, took to action right away, informing our communities about what was happening, just talking to people, letting them know what was coming, because unfortunately nobody had the right information or even knowledge of what was being proposed in these areas and what was already happening in terms of exploration. So our big role in our big role is really unapologetically taking up space and ensuring that our viewpoints are being put into everything. And I'm going to talk about this policy quite a bit because, like I mentioned before, it's quite flawed. When this policy was designed and created, it really does say nothing about treaty or Aboriginal rights. And much like lots of policy in Alberta, it excludes Indigenous people and often has negative impacts on our treaty and Aboriginal rights. I also want to mention that these areas, there's all these different treaty areas in Alberta, so Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and arguably all of these treaties and all of these nations should have been consulted before that policy was rescinded. And as you can kind of see by these two images I have here, the eastern slopes and the headwaters, the removal of this policy affects all of our treaty areas and really impacts kind of those headwaters. And because we're so far upstream, we really do have to spend that dedicated time because anything that happens in these areas makes its way all the way downstream. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the coal policy doesn't align well with treaty. There's lack of Indigenous consultation, and there's a continuous lack of recognition of Indigenous sciences and connections to land. I will also note that with treaty, we hear this often that treaty was only agreed to the depth of a European plow. And I don't know if you've ever looked for coal, it lies much deeper than the depth of a plow, and therefore in violation of some of the simplest language within our treaty documents. And so if you're wondering what open pit coal mines look like, they're quite devastating. These pictures, always make me quite sad. They make my heart ache. Open pit coal mining is when they use a really harmful method of extraction, and they actually blow off the top of mountains and burrow right on the topsoil there deeper and deeper and deeper to extract the coal. And oftentimes, these areas can't be reclaimed back to any type of, livable state of the land. And companies don't have the best track record of doing any restoration work on these areas once they've got the coal out. This photo here is from the Elk Valley in BC, which is just on the other side of the Alberta-BC border. So really close to the areas where these other proposed projects are. So you can see from this map here, these are all of the different coal projects that are being proposed in this one watershed. And the Oldman Watershed, like you said, is already threatened. We've seen water levels go down. We've seen the impacts in communities after the dam that happened, the Oldman Dam that was put in place. And so now these areas are under even more threat due to open pit coal mining. I'll also note that these coal companies are all foreign owned. They're all Australian owned mining companies who have no regard for Indigenous ways of life, knowing, and lots of them see consultation as just this mere stepping stone in them getting their approvals. So they really don't care. You can also see the closeness and proximity. So the blood reserve here is where I'm from. And like you said, the Oldman River borders the north end of our reserve. It also flows directly through the Piikani First Nation, which is also one of the nations of the Blackfoot Confederacy. And proximity to these mines is really devastating because one, they pose a severe threat to water quantity and water quality. But there's also issues of like air quality. In southern Alberta, we get a lot of wind. And so to have such an open, exposed space that has harmful chemicals that could be blown onto our lands as well is really scary to think about. These are a list of all of the companies and all of their different projects. I'll also note that these companies think they're sneaky by trying to switch up their names, or they switch out their project names. And so it took us a lot to pull lots of these things together to fully understand what is happening and continues to happen. All of these projects are in different stages, whether they have done their exploration already or they've submitted their applications on provincial and federal levels. All of these companies have been engaged in some form of consultation with First Nations tribal governments in the Treaty 7 area. But unfortunately, that consultation very rarely ever extends to the membership of these nations, which also is a really big issue. And that's where NWP falls in, because we don't believe that there should be any mining or further degradation in these areas. Water truly is life, and this is where the water that sustains our nation, this is where it derives from. And so, as you can see here, these are some of the different watersheds, and all these projects just in one small watershed here that flows all the way across. Another map. These maps here, I don't know these ones, but they also just further highlight kind of where they are in terms of the different waterways. And as you can imagine, open pit coal mining has major environmental effects, from decreased water quantity, but also loss of habitat for endangered species, including some endangered trout species in the area, and lots of the animals that we use in terms for ceremony and for livelihood that reside in these areas will also be impacted. As you can imagine, open pit coal mining is quite loud, so it can have long-standing impacts on animals who migrate through the area and may be forced to leave. There's also a lot of other, scary things that come with open pit coal mining, and I won't touch on all of these, but I wanted to point your attention to kind of the safety one. When we think about the safety in our communities and the safety of our Indigenous women and two-spirited people, we have to always acknowledge the high correlation between resource extraction and violence against Indigenous girls, women, and two-spirited people. Those two things exist in the same space, and by allowing companies to come in and molest these areas, unfortunately, that also leads to violence against women and two-spirited people in our communities who always need our protection. You can talk about it on a rights-based side as well. Mining exploration, continuous degradation has major impacts on our Indigenous rights, both our inherent and our treaty and Aboriginal rights, and the cumulative impacts. These areas in the Eastern Slopes and Porcupine Hills, mining isn't the only threat. I mentioned earlier a bit about the agriculture activity in the area. There's lots of clear cutting done in the area. There's, the traffic flow because of the major highways, all of which have continuously disrupted the headwaters area and the animals that reside in these areas. These things continue to build up and continue to make the areas where we as Niitsitapi, where we can openly practice our traditional ways, it makes those areas shrink and shrink and shrink. And some more about kind of like what's happening in this area, lots of development, lots of people using it in ways that are not sustainable, and just really making a mess in these really important areas that are not just environmentally sensitive, but are culturally important as well. And the continuous Indigenous erasure of these areas. Like I mentioned earlier, that narrative of like the Blackfoot being the children of the plains has been really harmful in how these areas are viewed, because we're seen as not being active in the mountain areas when that's quite false. We've always been active in these areas. We continue to be active in these areas, and we have contributed to the success and livelihood in these places and these landscapes. And so that removal of Indigenous representation and traditional ecological knowledge from government policies and from land land stewardship practices has been really detrimental to these landscapes. And this, these two things go hand in hand in terms of inaccessibility and exclusion of Indigenous people. As I start to kind of wind down, I just want to remind people that water is truly a gift, and it's a gift that is provided to us by Mother Earth and by Niitsitapi, which is the creator. And we as Niitsitapi, or as Indigenous people, we recognize the sacredness of water and its places of origins. We have a responsibility to protect the land water within our traditional territories. And like many people have mentioned earlier today, these things are all connected, from our history and our ceremonies to the water and the animals. All of these things rely on one another to not only survive, but to thrive and to live a good life on the land here. So open pit coal mining is really not what we want to see in these areas. NWP has been doing a lot to raise awareness about these mines. We've done a lot of different public engagement things with members of the Blackfoot Confederacy, from community awareness. We also led a federal petition where we got over 20,000 signatures from across Canada. That led to all metallurgical coal mines to be subject to both provincial and federal review, which is kind of a win. But again, it brings into question how good consultation, or if you agree with the consultation process, because consultation with First Nations would have to take place, but that doesn't always make it down to the membership and doesn't recognize our sovereignty or our traditional collective decision-making processes. And so our goal really is to see no coal mines on Niitsitapi land. And we use Niitsitapi. Niitsitapi is the Blackfoot word for how we describe ourselves. It translates to the real people. And this isn't meant to be an exclusive term. It really is inclusive. It's people of this land, people who are taking care of it. And so we hope not to see any coal mines, not just in Treaty 7 or in Blackfoot territory, but anywhere. We hope to see the revival of lands and waters, because we are Niitsitapi. We all have this responsibility to protect the land and water for not just ourselves, but for all of our future generations.